So before we get started, I gotta ask you guys this question. What do you think about all of the conversations that people are having around reopening and going to the beach? And it seems like different people are handling this in different days, and I'm really curious to know what your impressions are.
Personally, I think that I wouldn't be one of those people that are gonna be going out soon because
Yeah,
you never really know if it actually stopped the spread or like if we are containing it or if it's slowing down. I think well, I don't know if it's a rumor, if it's true about the one governor that died in one of the European countries. I'm not sure. Um, I'm not sure if that's true, so I also want clarification on that. And I think it's kind of scary because you really don't know what's going to go on in the future.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Anybody else? Well, I think you hit the nail on the head on a couple things. So, in Fahrenheit 451 and in our classes in general, we talk a lot about critical thinking, right? And that means taking a long look at the evidence and thinking about different perspectives on the arguments and trying to figure out through all of that how we can get closer to an understanding of what's real and true. I don't see anybody doing that. I mean, in these conversations that I see about people going back anyway, I mean, I see a lot of people doing that, but usually they're medical professionals and they're not in politics. I'm with you. I'm staying inside until I have some indicators that this is not going to hurt my family. Um, and I think it's mind-boggling to me how people can still say things like, "Oh, it's a hoax," or, um, I mean, all of us have known at least one person, I think, who's been sick or even died recently, and I can't imagine just playing around and taking my chances with it. But I was really curious to know what you thought, because I'm always, I'm only one person. I only have so much information, and if somebody's got a better idea than I do, well, by gosh, I want to hear it. So that's why I thought I would ask. The only country that I can uh, point to that's putting a good example out there right now is New Zealand. They actually have a testing system in place so that if anybody gets it, they know exactly who that person is and who they come into contact with and how they can meaningfully protect the community. Um, I would love to see us get there, but right now, it seems like kind of a mess. All right, now that I've cheered us up, did you have a chance to read that essay? Please say yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for saying yes. Did you actually?
No, wait, sorry. I mean, I didn't like read all of it, but I did skim it all.
Okay, so let's start with your questions for me. I'd like to know from you, and feel free to take a look through it. I've actually, oops, I just managed to change screens without sharing the screen. Um, if you want to open it on your machine, that's fine. We can also take a look at it together this way. And actually, I'm going to share my screen so that I can put it up on the screen. Can you guys see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is start with your questions. If there's something that you were wondering why I wrote the way that I wrote it, or what my point was, or what you think the theme was, or the tone, everything's fair game. But I'm genuinely curious to know if there's anything I can answer for you first before we talk about the elements that I want us to focus on, and then how we're going to go ahead and write our own.
I just wanted to comment, like, I did read and like skim a lot of it, and I think one part I was kind of like confused on like what you wanted to do with like when you started connecting it to Hamlet,
Uh-huh.
like to Hamlet. What did you want like the purpose like from us like the readers to take away from that comparison?
Okay, great question. So that was in the beginning, right? That was back up here. And I think I mentioned Gatsby also. So in this passage, when I wrote about the first time I read Hamlet, was really in support of this statement that we should read the same books more than once over time. And my reason for pointing that out was that like all of you, as hard as it is to believe, and by the way, my mom got a huge kick out of the fact that she broke into our class on Friday. Um, but like all of you, I'm actually a human being who went to high school. And like all of you, a lot of the things that I was reading in high school didn't really connect with me in the way that they do now. So one of the things that I wanted people to understand was I didn't get this from Fahrenheit 451 all the first time that I read it. And everything that we read has layers and levels of meaning. So another example I might have given, have any of you, I know Odalise and Emma have younger siblings, have any of you ever read a kid's book or watched a kid's show like Sesame Street, and
Yeah.
you're laughing at one set of jokes and they're laughing at another set of jokes? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that was why I included this. And if you notice, I went from Hamlet to something that we read together in American Lit, Gatsby, and then I backed into Fahrenheit 451. So I took something that was like super inaccessible and Shakespearean classic, and then gradually moved it toward what we're doing together. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Sure. What else? Anybody? Any questions that you have about anything that you saw here? Because there was a lot. Okay, then in that case, what I'd like to do is sort of track through the essay and share how I develop a thesis. Because what looks like the thesis statement up here, that we should read the same books more than once, isn't really the focus of the entire essay. The essay actually winds up having much more to do with the themes and the writing techniques in Fahrenheit 451. In fact, this attention getter sort of italicized introduction doesn't really have anything to do with any of it. It really has to do with how we read what we read. And when you write a 5-paragraph essay in high school, the temptation is to have a very clear attention getter for a few sentences, a clear sentence or two that outlines your thesis, 2 or 3 body paragraphs that provide reasons, details, or facts that support that, and then a conclusion that restates your main points and leaves the reader thinking. I mean, that is the basic recipe for a high school essay, right? By that standard, this thing is a complete maze and it doesn't fit that formula at all. So one question I imagine some of you had is, well, Dr. Preston, why did you write this in this way? Did anybody wonder that? Because it kind of meanders all over the place.
I did.
Yeah. So I'll share my thought process with you. In the very beginning, this is definitely attention getting, I hope. But it's also designed to think out loud on paper about the thought process itself. The whole background here about the word essay is designed to get the reader thinking about, like, okay, so what is this thing that I'm reading and what's it designed to do? And Elise, if you could turn off your mic, I think you get a lot of background noise there. Here, I'll help you out. And then if you want to let me know something, just chime in and I'll unmute you, okay? When I get to this bit here, that's taking the essay and then trying to make the connection about reading things more than once. It isn't until we get here now that I'm starting to connect the dots. And now this is about my experience with Fahrenheit 451, but even still, this is about me reading it. It's not really about the actual writing technique until we get to here and the word visceral. Did anybody track what we meant by visceral? Did anybody click on this?
I clicked on it. Yeah.
Okay. So, geez, Odalise, what's going on in your house?
I'm sorry.
That's okay. It just cracked me up. I heard, "Wah!" I don't know. Is that a video
no.
game?
My
Huh?
sisters were watching TV and I accidentally pressed mute, I think.
It's definitely more exciting than anything that happens in class. I'll tell you that. All
No,
right.
yeah.
So visceral means as if it's felt with the senses. And when you think about the scenes where even Clarice is starting to introduce Montag to a different way of thinking, or Montag walks through his neighborhood, you can hear the boots on his sidewalk in the quiet night. I love those scenes because the author, Ray Bradbury, does such a magical job of bringing us into those moments. And then after I'm in that world where I can really experience it with my senses, all of a sudden I remember I'm not in that world. That's an imaginative creation by a guy who was sitting at a typewriter in a basement of Powell Library at UCLA, which looks like, now that I'm doing this online, I may as well show you. Pick an image. So this is Powell Library. And when you walk up into this entryway, you can either go upstairs, which is a really impressive library that looks like this, or you can go downstairs to the basement. I wonder if they have any pictures of the basement. Now, if I planned this as a lecture, I would have done all this ahead of time and dazzled you with the pictures right away. But nah, they don't have any pictures of the basement. It doesn't look like. But as you can imagine by the word basement, it's not a very attractive place. And they used to have, before computers, they used to have typewriters that you could rent by the hour. And I think it was like $0.10 an hour. And Ray Bradbury wrote this book in a week. I think it was like 10 days. But he wrote it partially that fast because he had these two stories, one of which we read was The Pedestrian. The other was called Bright Phoenix. And he combined them into a brief book, a novella called The Fireman. And then he expanded that into this book. So that process is important for me as I write this essay, because in my mind, I'm wanting the reader to remember that this is not a real world. This is Ray Bradbury just sitting at a typewriter like I would sit at my word processor and create something for all of us. Now, here we have setting, right? We've got figurative language and we've got that visceral sensory stuff. And then I talk about illusion. You can see traces of the pedestrian like we talked about as we read. And by the way, I'm hoping that it was like at least a little bit satisfaction for you guys to be in on the inside joke. I'm sure you're aware that when you watch Sesame Street and your little kid sister isn't getting the jokes that you get, sometimes we all have that sense when we read a book with a teacher and the teacher like wants us to understand stuff, but we don't really get it. I'm hoping that by reading The Pedestrian first, at least it gave you a bit of a sense of being on the inside joke. Now, here's a footnote that is a direct comment on blowing right past illusions. If I scroll down to that note number 7, the same is true for footnotes. If you're reading this, yay you. How many people actually read the footnotes as they went through this?
I did.
Did you? Because I thought about testing people by saying, who did I hit in the first grade? Does anybody know?
Oh, I remember reading
Did
it.
you? So, I think I mentioned in that part about Daisy that I would never hit anybody. In this day and age, I should
Oh
probably
yeah,
be
that's
clear.
true. Because you said you and your students were talking about how you guys started hating Daisy.
Yeah, exactly. And I wanted to slap her, and then I went, but I would never touch another person. But in the 3rd grade, so let's see, it was Greg Wolfus. Ah, yes, to Greg Wolfus, wherever you are, I'm sorry. Nobody else in the world can honestly say I punched them in the face. Now, going back up to the body of the essay. So once we go through that, let me get to the right spot here. Now I'm connecting the dots. So when I read Fahrenheit 451 in junior high school, I was told that the book was about censorship. Now, remind me, because I think some of you read it last year with another teacher, right?
Fahrenheit 451?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let me guess, you were told it was about censorship.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's part of it. That's not necessarily wrong, but it's not complete either. And a lot of people who just look at SparkNotes or just go through the traditional curriculum and don't dig deeper, that's all they ever know. And so what I wrote here was that it made sense. The theme goes with Bradbury's own love for books, etc. But here I write about how sometimes teachers in school and those kinds of analyses make things too simple. In a way, it's a warning about what happens if you break the rules, and that's true enough. In fact, in school, I wrote, rules are what school is all about, so how could the book be about anything else? But the irony here, and somebody remind me, what's irony? Oh dear. Nobody remembers irony?
Something that like you don't mean literally to say, you mean kind of the opposite.
Exactly. Good job. So you know how on the back wall of the classroom it says blank walls are a crime, and it's got the police officer spray painting the graffiti? You remember that print that I had
Yeah.
in the classroom? Well,
Yeah.
the irony is that's on a blank wall. That's supposed to be ironic. Now you know. Here, the irony is that too many people fall for the spectacle, right? And they miss the deeper meaning. So the spectacle in Fahrenheit 451 is the censorship, but there's a deeper meaning to the book. And I didn't get that in school when I read it. I had to learn that later on. The deeper meaning of the book, and here's where I really get into the thesis statement for this essay, points to the deeper meaning in ourselves. Montag says to Faber, we have everything we need to be happy, but we aren't happy. Montag's entire existence in this book is a search for what's missing. He says, something's missing. I looked around. The only thing I positively knew was gone was the books I'd burned. But Faber comes back on that too. It's not the books. We can burn the books, but remember the guys at the end of the story? They're carrying the knowledge around in their heads, and they're living it with their values and their actions. So Faber says, it's not the books you need, it's some of the things that once were in books. So it is with us. Now, I don't know about you guys, but when I was in school, one of the things that always got my attention was that it seemed like no matter where I went, there was always some teacher who had an inspirational poster about how I could live my life. I'm sure you've seen these. Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do they make you just want to go out and crush it?
No.
No, not
If they do, that's
not
awesome. And I
necessarily.
don't know which one. To me, they were always hugely frustrating because I was sitting in class and they were telling me how great things could be. And then I was like, I had to ask for a pass if I needed to pee. It didn't go together for me.
Yeah.
So when I think about Montag living in this life, you know, Clarice shows up and makes him question, but then she disappears. Mildred is like a waste of space, not to be mean to Mildred, but there's just nothing inside of her. And she doesn't want there to be. It's too painful. Beatty is a threat. And so really the easiest thing for Montag would be to just not go through all of this. And I hear I reference the movie Scent of a Woman, where Al Pacino plays a guy who talks about a student who demonstrates being moral and doing the hard thing. But he says, you know, I always knew what the right path was without exception, but I never took it because it was too hard. So now we come to it. Whatever else Fahrenheit 451 is about, it's about consciousness, connection, integrity, and self-determination. Risky, radical, even violent self-determination. Montag has to torch someone with a flamethrower to set himself free, which obviously is a dramatic exaggeration, but in a way, here's where Montag and Hamlet have something in common. And I do close that loop later in the essay. But when Hamlet says to be or not to be, a lot of SparkNotes kinds of analyses and classes paint Hamlet as a teenager with a decision-making disorder. And by the way, has anyone read Hamlet yet? Okay, but
No.
you've all heard to be or not to be, right?
Yeah.
And usually when people say that, it's such a cliche, like to be or not to be. But think about it. I mean, really, because what else is worth asking in this life? And it's not just, should I kill myself or should I live? Although sometimes people interpret Hamlet that way. Really what Hamlet's saying in that moment is, what kind of a person do I want to become? And how are my actions going to define that? If you've ever been on the threshold of a decision, should I take this job? Should I try out for the team? Should I go this place or that place for college? Should I ask him or her out? Whether or not you do any of these things almost doesn't matter, because in an hour, you're going to be a different person either way. You're either going to be a person who tells yourself a story about the risk that you took, or you're going to tell yourself a story about the fact that you didn't. So Montag has to make the same choice. Am I going to settle for knowing that I'm not happy and being like Mildred? Or am I going to explore and find a way home to being my whole self with integrity? And then I get into the technique. So now that I have my thesis statement, here's what Fahrenheit 451 is about. Now I'm going to talk about how Ray Bradbury does it. It's in Montag's hands. He literally takes his life into his own hands. Remember, as we read, every once in a while, I would comment on the imagery of Montag's hands. Sometimes they're a simile, sometimes they're a metaphor, but there's a lot going on with hands in this book. And that starts with the first paragraph. Quote, his hands were the hands of some amazing conductor, playing all the symphonies of blazing and burning to bring down the tatters and charcoal ruins of history. Later, when Montag steals a book, he acts like his hands don't even belong to him. And over time, what starts in his hands, and here I am moving my hands, actually starts to get contagious to the rest of his body. His hands had been infected, soon it would be his arms. So that's Ray Bradbury's way of giving us the clue that Montag starts with a simple question. Why am I not happy? Then he gets into a simple action. He takes a book, and then he takes another book. And over time, he realizes that it's not just enough to ask a question or take a book. He needs to make some major adjustments in his life. And then, of course, Beatty accelerates things by, since Mildred calls in the alarm, he has to make some immediate changes in a very dramatic way. It's also not insignificant to me that Beatty mentions Hamlet. And this is where I just talked about this a little bit, but you can read and go back and review what I just said, because sometimes it's useful to illustrate a point by referring to another work. And so as you think about your essay, I always invite students in their thinking about one book to bring in elements of other stories. While we read, it was interesting to me, some of you mentioned The Giver, some of you mentioned The Hunger Games. Can anyone think of other references that we came up with to compare Fahrenheit 451? I feel like there were more, but I can't remember what they were.
I feel like those were the main ones we mentioned.
Okay. And then I connected all of this with the hero's journey, because the monomyth, the story that cultures have told, no matter where they are on Earth throughout history, all has the same ingredients. And if we were in class, and I may actually go back to this before we leave each other for the summer. You've all seen Star Wars?
I have.
Yeah.
Okay. So Star Wars is the classic example of the monomyth. There's a challenge to go on an adventure. For Montag, it was Clarice's conversation as an unexpected thing that got him thinking. For Luke Skywalker, it was the hologram of Princess Leia and then coming home to find his aunt and uncle's place burned. Usually the invitation to an adventure doesn't come in a way that we want or that we're looking for. It's an unexpected thing that happens that causes us to pay attention. For a lot of people right now, the coronavirus and the quarantine and all the things that are happening around us are causing us to think about our lives in a different way. You can either look at that as a crisis or a source of stress, or you can see it as an opportunity, and it's a cruel opportunity. I'm not trying to make it a positive, fun thing at all by any means. But what the hero's journey tells us is that, and I'll click on this link just so you can get a little bit of background. The monomyth basically says, if I scroll to the call to adventure here, the hero begins in a situation of normality from which some information is received that acts as a call to head off into the unknown. Oh, and they even use Luke Skywalker or Frodo Baggins as examples. For people who are going through this moment in their lives, that can be a really interesting crisis. And I use those words on purpose. So like Hamlet, Montag contemplates action that will change his life. He even takes some half measures. He steals, he hides and reads books, and then he gets a little bit more dramatic. He gets a little bit riskier when he recites poetry to Mildred's friends. But Montag isn't as thoughtful as Hamlet. To be fair, the melancholy Dane read more books. He was a prince. When Hamlet calls Polonius a fishmonger, he's acting crazy. When Montag gets cranky on the subway, he actually seems like he really is going a bit crazy because he can't get organized in his own thinking. Hamlet thinks first and acts second. Montag acts, perceives, and then tries to understand. Even when he torches Beatty with the flamethrower, his hands are still foreigners. So when we go back to talking about Ray Bradbury's writing, here I talk about his predictions, all of the things that he predicts in this book. And now I'm getting toward the end. This is actually where I wrap up. Faber tells Montag that we need high quality information. No one goes it alone. Montag needed Clarice and Faber. And here I talk about how our self-determination is determined by our interdependence. Look at how much we need each other even in this moment. I mean, if you think about it, how can you have a leader if you don't have followers? How could I be a teacher if I don't have any students? You know what a teacher is without students? Just some person in a room talking. So all of us are defined by our relationships and our connections with each other, and that's true for Montag as well. That's why Granger at the end in that group by the campfire becomes so important. The other men helped and Montag helped, and there in the wilderness, the men all moved their hands, putting out the fire together. So here, one last time, I come back to how it would be easier for Montag just to blow things off. And then I talk about the fact that really this book is an invitation for us to follow Montag. It's not just a message against censorship. It's a message to all of us that in order to find our best selves and live that way, we're going to have to walk through the fire and we're going to have to take action. And to the extent that we do, the future's in our hands. Now, in the precious few moments we have before my Zoom call cuts out on me, what do you think would be a good essay prompt for us to write on in this book? Or would you like me just to set up some things that I want you to include, not give a prompt, and say, go for it, write an essay?
I like the second option.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I want to second that idea.
Okay. Well, that's as clear a vote as I've ever heard from our classes. So why don't I do this? Today, I'm going to go on and include the ingredients that I think are important. I'm going to invite you to comment and add or subtract anything because I want to do this together. And then tomorrow, what I'll do is I'll tackle the prompt as I would do it. And I'll show you, I'll put up my word processor to screen share. And we'll use this week, and I know some of you are taking the AP exam, we'll do this in a way that can kill two birds with one stone. Everyone will get the roadmap in both American Lit and AP for writing the essay on the novel. And then for the AP students, I'll also add a satellite prompt that we can use for rhetorical analysis as prep for our Friday meeting and continuing to prepare for the exam. Does that work for you guys?
Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Awesome. Does anybody have any questions for me before we break for the day?
Dr. Preston, can you send the code for the AP and like just like on the new post so we can see it up?
For the Zoom meeting?
Yeah, because sometimes I lose it for like the AP test because I only have this one copied and the other one I
Oh,
couldn't
yeah.
find.
Absolutely. I'll tell you what, I'll put it on the blog and I'll also send you an email with it.
Okay, thank you.
And then I missed you on Friday. I started the Sneeches, so I'm going to start again so that we can make it this week.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Have a good day, everybody.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.